I call the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. And again, I won't take too much of your time, but I will take the opportunity...
I'm sure you'll take 5 minutes, Mr O'Connor.
No, I'll take the opportunity to speak on part two, Mr Chairman. And there's a couple of issues here that I would like to refer to in particular. And it's presenting and publishing departmental annual reports and the issue of responsibility of directors, responsibility for and administration use of appropriations. A couple of issues, and I must refer, I guess, to my portfolio area of responsibility of primary industries. And I have been studying the reports of government in this area for 4 years now, and I'm assuming that the responsibility here is stated that these must be accurate. And I think we consider it's desirable to allow whole sector across agency reporting. And so the Select Committee has clearly said that it wants clear and accurate reporting. Well, if I can take the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry as an example, and I know that has now been merged into a new super ministry, there were two particular, one issue there on rural proofing, which was a policy introduced by the last Labor government, and it was to ensure that in every area of government policy consideration, the effect on rural communities was to be considered. In fact, a template had been developed, and the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, which is and Rural Affairs, as it was kind of assumed, was responsible for ensuring the implementation of that. And in fact, the annual report stated that. But it wasn't happening. It wasn't happening. And the only ability that we had, of course, was through the Select Committee process, a relatively brief period, to ask the Minister and officials why it wasn't happening. And indeed, what often happened is other issues overtook the investigation into this area. And so what I'm hoping that this bill will demand of government agencies not only reporting, but accurate reporting. And the issue I referred to in part one, of course, is about, I guess, accountability of the CEO or the Minister and who should take what responsibility. So I raised that as one of the points. The second one, in fact, I had referred to two before, but there's one other one. The authority to lend money. And if I can refer to the current situation of the Ministry for Primary Industries, and that is they have a grand scheme called Primary Growth Partnership, where the Minister's indicated up to $600+ million will be allocated on basically a one-for-one system, where the taxpayer will put up over $300 million and the industry will put up over $300 million. And so they'll get on with projects that have no doubt been, we're told, they've been scrutinised. What we haven't been told is how they're accountable. So the question I ask, there's no authority to lend money through Part 2 here, but if the money that was allocated to a project is deemed not to have delivered, is there a requirement to repay, and could that be considered loaned money? Now, it's technical, but the bill's technical. And not having an authority to lend money means that when an agency like MPI allocates, and we're talking tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, when they allocate that to a project that has a joint venture arrangement, is that appropriation or allocation deemed a gift, or is it a loan, or is there any requirement for the money to be repaid if there's no delivery on the KPIs or the projected outcomes? Because at this particular point, there are a few projects that have been running half their life, and there's not one substantive narrative report on progress. Narrative. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Thank you for that. Mr Mallard. There's not one substantive narrative report on progress of PGP. So if Mr Chairman,
The Honourable
thank
Damien O'Connor.
If indeed the Select Committee or Audit New Zealand or anyone deems these projects to have been a failure, will that money have to be repaid? And will that therefore mean that the lend money or the authority to lend money requirements and provisions that are in this Part 2 should have taken account of that possible scenario? Mr Chairman, the next part I'll go on to, and hopefully the Minister will answer a few of these questions. The next one is the responsibility of directors. And there's a good lesson in here. And while the directors of Crown entities are different from the directors of state-owned enterprises, basically they have the same moral responsibility, that is to return to the taxpayers. But I'm not quite sure whether these provisions here mirror those of the state-owned enterprises, because we've had a classic example in Solid Energy, which is not a which is a state-owned enterprise, not a Crown entity, but nonetheless owned by the taxpayer, returning to the taxpayer, hopefully returns on their investment, on their efforts, and dividends. And so there was a clear, in my view, failure of the directors of that company to keep it in order. And what we have here through clause 92 is the intention of this clause to allow directors of companies listed in Schedule 4 of the Act to act in certain circumstances in the best interest of the shareholders rather than in the best interest of the company. And I guess a state-owned enterprise would act in the best interest of the company. And this is saying, I assume, that directors should act always in the best interest of the shareholders. It's one and the same if the Crown owns the company, although we appreciate with the idiotic sell-down of state-owned enterprises by this government, their determination to hand 49% of SOEs into the hands of wealthy New Zealanders who can afford to buy a whole lot of shares, or worse still, as we know, a whole lot of offshore investors, Mr Speaker. That is a difference between the SOEs. There are, however, some Crown entities, and I'm not sure, Assure Quality is, I'm told, a state-owned enterprise. And that's one that's done a deal with the Chinese, but I won't carry on. I know this has been slightly out of the scope of the bill, Mr Chairman, but I will stay within it. So the responsibility here clearly are to the shareholders, as they should be, rather than to the company as an entity. Well, that's the way I read it. Indeed, it's refreshing, and it's something perhaps we should apply to the state-owned enterprises as well. I think that there's some interpretation issues there, and I guess that the Select Committee has gone through that. Mr Chairman, I don't have too much more to say on Part 2 of the bill, other than to re-emphasise and repeat the questions that I've raised, of course, around the accuracy of reporting. On departmental annual reports, they are generally glossy. Most people often don't read the detail, but indeed it could be said that too often they are inaccurate. The second point, as I said, was the authority to lend money, and if money is appropriated or handed over or allocated to projects, then is there a requirement for that money to be repaid? And I'm suggesting with PGP that there's probably not a requirement to be repaid, and I'm hoping that this particular clause or this part of the bill doesn't eliminate the possibility that money could be repaid as a loan would be if there are not the outcomes as laid down in the proposal that might have been accepted by officials. not terribly complex, just one of basic accountability. And I have to say, with Primary Growth Partnership, there is a lot to be learned, a lot to be explained, and indeed there may be a lot of money to be repaid if, in fact, those projects haven't delivered on what they said they would.
The Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got lots of dog